I'm Lynn Walker. I am going to just tell the story of what it was like growing up with a father who was a Miami undercover agent who then ended up on the other side smuggling into the country. He was a very protective father. He was very cautious about keeping his undercover world separate from our family. The summer that I turned 8, Dad snuck out of the house literally in the dark of night and left a note in the mailbox for Mom. That just really set my world upside down. That dramatic shift from one day having this loving, protective father to the next day having none and no explanation was just left a big hole in my life. A few weeks later, he did come back to see Mom, and I remember them sitting in the kitchen, him not saying a lot, and her crying, saying, "When are you coming home?" And I remember he just sort of rolled his eyes. That made it really clear to me he is not coming back. Right before we started 7th grade, my mom moved us out of Miami. It was getting really dangerous down there. One of her nurse friends who didn't live far from us got murdered, so she moved us to Columbus, Ohio. And I started 7th grade there without knowing a soul. And it wasn't long before I got befriended by these other misfits, right? The other kids that didn't fit in. Somebody passed around it. And I remember when that entered my bloodstream, I felt like something good was about to happen. Like for the first time in years, I felt like I was about to be happy any minute. When I did see my dad, which wasn't often, he would always say things like, "You've got to be the prettiest girl in school. And, if I was your age, I'd make you my girlfriend." And I mean, he just kind of sexualizing that relationship. Not that he ever abused me, but he just didn't really know how to have, I think, a relationship with me anymore. I started really latching onto that. I started very young, trying to get his attention. And the attention I seemed to get was if I could look really good and pretty and be really good. Sadly, at a very young age, start to chase men around and got pretty promiscuous, actually. I was 13 the first time I used drugs. I instantly liked that feeling, and I started chasing that feeling because it was the only thing that took away that sense of impending doom. And so I started chasing that. My addiction took me into some pretty dark places pretty quick. At 13, I was a runaway on the streets of Columbus, was being invited to get with some people that I was pretty sure were. Somehow I knew that what they were, and so I took off running down the alley. Was hitchhiking that week and almost got raped at a roadside rest. And, ended up with a pretty sleazy carny. There was a big Ohio State Fair, which is a good place to get and meet boys. And so my next sort of boyfriend was the local drug dealer who had dropped out of high school. He got good. And by the time I was 14, we had been arrested for breaking and entering. Mark was his name. And I went to juvenile detention. And I was truant. I wasn't going to school. This is right around the time I found out that my dad was in prison. Here I am in juvie. They did let me out because it was my first offense. I got out with probation, house arrest. And you would think that maybe that might make a young person think about their use, right? I'm arrested, breaking and entering. My dad's now in prison. But actually, what it made me feel when I heard that he was in prison was I felt like for the first time in years, Dad and I were connected again. That I turned out more like him than I could have even imagined. And that we shared this love of, apparently, was a bond for me. I was imagining maybe the we got was from Dad. It very well could have been. I don't know. He was moving a lot of. I just kept on going. I just kept chasing that feeling and we just would take anything that we could get our hands on. My dad was bigger than life, so charismatic. He was the one in the room with everyone standing around him. He had all these awards from the police department, and he had made at the time, the largest bust in Miami's history. He and his partner. I mean, he was a decorated policeman. I think that's why he was able to be a good smuggler, because he knew how to lead two different lives. By the time he started smuggling, he knew how to smuggle because he'd been doing it for years as an undercover agent. It was actually my boyfriend at the time who told me that my dad was in prison. He had learned of it from my brother, and I was totally stunned. I couldn't believe it. I felt, for the first time in years, connected to my dad again. Somehow I had turned out so much like him, and I hadn't been around him for years because he was in prison and I had been in juvie, and we apparently shared this love of So it was very bonding, strangely, for me. Later that evening when I talked to my mom, she had said, yes, he got arrested with a lot of... And I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, when the DEA agent called me, he said, lady, it was a plane full, 2 cargo trucks full, so 15,000 pounds. By the time I'm 15, my mom is afraid for my life, no doubt. She takes me to court and files charges against me for being what's called an unruly child. This was the era of tough love. And what that did is it made me a ward of the juvenile court. And so the judge said, listen, you can do what your mom says and what the court-appointed social worker says, and you can go to school and you can live at home. Or you can finish high school in juvenile detention center. You choose. So I said, okay. And again, you would think that this might be enough to straighten a kid out, but all it did was I just got a lot sneakier. I just did that didn't make me have slurred speech, or if I was going to drink or do that would cause that, I did it when my mom was working the evening shift so I could get in bed before, she got home. I just got a lot sneakier. There's a saying, how do you know when an addict is lying? Their lips are moving. Well, that was it, right? So, and I did start going to school and working really hard, and I actually ended up getting an honor roll. Boy, did that get everybody off my back. The principal's now off my back. The judge is off my back. The mom's off my back. I found the secret, right? So I did this tightrope walk of being on honor roll and getting whenever I could. And after a year, the courts removed that order from my life, so I was no longer a ward of the court. I guess it did plant a little seed that maybe life could be different. By now, my boyfriend is really getting bad. He's very possessive, very jealous. If anybody even just looks at me, he's beating the out of him. When he drinks hard, all things are getting really bad. And I'm thinking, well, maybe, my principal's like, you could go to college with these grades. I'm thinking, college? What? I had no idea. And I started to think, well, maybe I wanted to do that. And I told my boyfriend I was thinking about going to college, and he went ballistic. Just, you're trying to dump me and find another boyfriend. I did actually start applying. I just never told him. And I got this little scholarship to study art and go to college. So finally, I have this idea that I'm going to go to college and change my life. And, I got this boyfriend who won't have it. And I do finally get away from him with my life barely, at the end of a sawed-off shotgun. I basically said, I'm going to college. I want us to just be friends. And he went into the bedroom, sort of pacing, just getting really agitated. And he put his fist, I heard this sort of smashing sound. He had put his fist through a TV. And I went in there, and his, hand was just dripping with blood, right? Just running. But I didn't know if he'd cut his wrist or not. And I thought he was going to, bleed to death. And then he went and locked himself in the bathroom. And I was trying to get him to come out so I could take him to the emergency room. And as soon as he came out of that bathroom, I knew I should have got the hell out of there. And I raced for the apartment door, but he got there before me and wouldn't let me out. He had his hand all bandaged up. And, he dragged me into the bedroom, and there was this sawed-off shotgun, and he raped me. When he finished, he took that shotgun and he stuck the barrel in his mouth and the butt in my hands and said, put me out of my effing misery, pull the effing trigger. He's screaming, and I thought I either kill him or he's going to kill me. I just thought for sure I was going to die, and I had remembered, my dad said, don't ever point a gun at someone, unless you plan on shooting him. And there he was screaming at me. And I just looked in his eyes, and I could just see for a moment there that he was just wild. And I just started talking really calmly and said, Mark, this isn't what you want, put the gun down, and he finally just grabbed the gun out of my hands and raced out of the apartment, and then I got the hell out of there. And the last thing I saw was him, my rear view mirror with that shotgun, sort of walking fast towards my car as I'm peeling out of the driveway. And, I never told anyone about that back then, because I didn't know. I didn't know that if I told the police, I figured it would be his word against mine. But also, as sad as it sounds, I realized it was my way out, because I had that hanging over his head. If he ever tried to bother me again, that I could maybe go to the police and tell what happened. And so in a way, I felt like it was my way out. It's my way to get him to leave me alone, because he was insane. He just wouldn't leave me alone. I mean, I certainly did a lot of work on that later and told people, but at the time I didn't tell my mom or report it or anything. As a lot of women don't. A lot of women don't ever report rapes, but I do get away from him. So I graduate from high school. I'm about to go to college. I finally got rid of the crazy boyfriend, and then I get a call from my dad. He has just gotten out of prison, and he wants to come out for my high school graduation. And I feel like this is it. Life is finally turning around for me. The minute I lay eyes on my dad, I can tell he did not get reformed in prison. He is back to big wads of cash. He's flying, and I'm pretty sure it's... So what happened is he met his big connection in the federal prison down in Florida. So there was a Colombian lord there who was continuing to run the family operation, help run it, from the minimum security prison. And within a couple months of being paroled, while on parole, Dad starts smuggling again. And this time it's all... So it's the mid-'80s, cowboy days, flooding into Miami, and Dad's right there in the thick of it. And pretty soon, so now I'm 18, my brother's 21, and my dad is dishing out his me and launches my brother's dealing career. And I know that it's a horrible thing to use with your kids, but in his defense, we already were actively using. My brother was already smuggling, and we willingly accepted his. I thought it was going to be I thought it was in heaven, because I had uncut from my father, who'd always been very protective of me. What could go wrong? But the problem is, if you're an addict, unlimited supply of is a nightmare. So it's not long before I'm using with both my dad and my brother. I'm down to Miami whenever I can to see my dad, and I think it's to visit him, but I also want that. He's willingly sharing it with me, and my brother and I are smoking it. There's one Saturday morning, my brother calls me. It's way too early. He says, hey, I need to bring some stuff over there for you to sit on for a while, because I got some heat here. There's helicopters flying over my house, and I think it's the cops. And I'm thinking, I said, maybe you just need to get some sleep. He'd been up for like 3 days smoking. He hadn't slept or eaten. I said, why don't you bring it over to my apartment, and I'll watch it for a few days and you get some sleep. So he comes over with this half kilo of cocaine, which is, a little more than a pound. It was a big gallon Ziploc bag full of my dad's uncut, which I was so happy to watch for my brother. He never said I couldn't use it. And so now 3 days later, I'm in bad shape. I figure I'll call my dad. He'll take care of this, right? He's my dad. It's his. I call him and I tell him what's going on, and he says, darling, that's what he always called me, I don't know nothing about this, but I'll call your brother and see if he's okay. And he hangs up. And just like that, 3 years of smoking and using it with my father and brother, I see this situation with crystal clarity, right? This is not a family business, and Dad's not protecting me anymore. Like, I'm going to take a fall. My brother's not going to come into the police station and say, oh no, officers, that's my... And my father's certainly not going to. He's still on parole. And so I call my brother and I say, you got to come and get this stuff. You got to get it out of the house. And he shows up, of course, and pulls out a scale to see how much I'd snorted, but I'd already cut it with some baking soda. And he, has a big snort and says, I miss this stuff. And he, by then the cop car is no longer sitting out front, and he takes his scales and he walks out. And, to this day, I don't know if those cops were watching us. I mean, we all had the same last name at the time. I don't know if they were watching me or not. That was the beginning for me of staying the hell away from my dad and my brother. I just had to stay away from them. I did start, getting involved in recovery and starting down a different path. But that was sort of the end of my journey with my dad and my brother. When I finally did get clean and sober, so I now have 29 years without any problem. And that didn't happen right away. I did two things right. I got a good therapist, and I always went back to the therapist, and I finally got honest. And I did get involved in 12-step recovery meetings, which really helped. And I just kept going back. Even when I would relapse, I'd keep going back. And I got honest about a lot of that stuff that happened. I didn't even understand what post-traumatic stress disorder was, but I definitely had that from, probably not just, mostly from the rape from Mark. And that's been a long journey. I've done a lot of work on that over the years, a lot, just to not be so easily triggered, because that's what post-traumatic stress disorder does, well, at least it did for me, sort of makes you hyper vigilant, right? Where you're constantly aware of danger. And it's a pretty miserable way to live. And also, I always wondered if Mark was following me. Like, I never used social media for years. I never used social media until I found out he actually killed himself. I live pretty free of that PTSD now, but even recently, like several years ago, I did some work on it still. So I did turn my life around. I stayed away from my dad for a long time. We were very estranged, obviously. I was very angry, and he, I imagine, was probably feeling very guilty. When I knew he was no longer smuggling, because I was actually involved in an intervention with him, he was dying in the hospital and his stomach was all ulcerated. I'm sure it was pain. I finally told his third wife what was going on. So we did this little intervention, and he did stop smuggling. And so I knew he wasn't smuggling anymore. I figured he was drinking. He had a long love affair with, but I started calling him just occasionally, like on his birthday or holidays, Father's Day. And it was always so awkward. We just didn't know how to talk. We never talked about what happened. And he never called me. I mean, I think he just felt too guilty. And so one day, out of the blue, he calls me. He did call if he was going into the hospital or something. And I said, when he called, I said, "What's wrong?" Right? He said, "What? Can a father call his daughter just to talk?" And I about died laughing. I'm like, of course he can, but you never do. I mean, he never called me. And we had the same usual awkward conversation, chit-chatty. And then there's this long, empty pause. And by then, I was running groups for kids whose parents were drug addicts now. So I'm helping these kids, right, who have addict parents, but I still am so estranged I can't even talk to my father. And something inside me just said, "This is your chance." And I just said, "Hey, Dad, someday I'd like to hear your story." And he said, "Why? You think that would be interesting?" And then I did laugh. I'm like, "Yes, you've led a life not a lot of people have led, but mostly I just want to know what happened. Like, how did you go from being this, dedicated cop and loving father, to walking away without a glance and ending up smuggling?" And he said, "Okay, you want to come out here and interview me?" And so I did. I went out and spent a couple weeks interviewing him, and he had so many memories, and some of them were shared because we did live together for several years, and that was kind of healing. And he had so many memories about undercover cases and the arrest and the smuggling, and I audio recorded all of it. And when I went back home, I thought, I got to write this. I did a lot of technical writing, but I'm like, I got to write this story. And I figured I'd just write it as fiction because I didn't know how much was true. When addicts' lips are moving, right? That's how you know they're lying. But I got his court records, and I found all these old newspaper articles, and they were word for word what he told me. And I realized that what he said to me when he started the recording was true. He said, "Darlin, this is your legacy. I'm sorry there isn't more good than bad, but I'm going to lay it all out there." And so when I realized it was all true, then I had to write that as a true story. And what happened is, as I was writing that, a lot of my story came out, the story of surviving my father. And so that's the first book that came out, Midnight Calling, a memoir of a smuggler's daughter. It's really about family bonds and addiction and holding on when it's way past time to let go. And then I wrote Dad's story, which is Breaking Midnight, a true story. Good cop goes bad, basically. And then those are pretty dark, gritty books. And I had readers say, "What happened after Midnight Calling?" So I wrote a sequel. I just published it this year, called A Perfectly Good Fantasy. It's a sequel to Midnight Calling. I would say it's darkly funny. They tried to keep it more lighthearted, but it's a darkly funny look at how I can use, and I think a lot of people, anything to try to change the way we feel, like relationships, even potato chips, right? But it's also a love story of sorts. So all those books really are about being broken. And I think that's why readers have been able to relate to it. They've been bestsellers on Amazon since I've published. It's only been 3 years since I published my first book. But I think that, my journey is one of hope. And I think the books offer a message of hope, right? I mean, I was a runaway and incarcerated youth and, strung out with my dad. And I now have a successful career. I'm married, have been married for 27 years now, and have 2 adult kids, just barely adult kids now. They're 19 and 21. I have a really peaceful family life and home. And now I'm able to work on this sort of second career of becoming a full-time author. And so I've just published my 3rd book in January and had enough success that I've able to become a full-time author. And so it's been an amazing journey. And I hope that that's a message for other people, right? Because addiction touches so many lives, so many lives. It's hard to find anyone who hasn't been touched somehow by addiction. But, I always say, and even if you're not struggling with addiction, never give up, right? Never give up, because life can turn on a dime. Life can turn on a dime. But some of these things you just can't deal with alone. I mean, you cannot beat addiction alone. It can't be done. I don't think it can be done. Even if some people might use a church or a higher power, it's hard to beat that alone. And you definitely can't get through trauma, right, without getting some kind of help, whatever that looks like. So I think that is the other message, right, that's been so powerful for me, is letting people in so that they can help me, because there's so much shame and secrecy around a lot of those issues. And it's hard to let people in and to get honest. And so that's been the other big key for me. Having that early abandonment from my father, especially when he was so loving to begin with and then just flipped and just disappeared, left such a hole in my heart that I just was always trying to fill it, right, with men. I mean, it was such a long journey for me to stop feeling that emptiness, right? And to find, a way to live a fulfilling life, without feeling like I just had that big hole in my heart. And so, I mean, I don't know if Dad had stayed, who knows what would have happened, but it just was such a setup for me, with so much promiscuous behavior and so much self-destructive behavior at such a young age. And so it's all tangled up in there together, it's like, it's hard for me to, I mean, it is, that's what it is. My dad's story and my story are very much entangled up. And not just the abandonment and the abuse later, the abuse together, but just the way that affected me, or the way I responded or reacted to that early loss. I just think that there's always hope. There's just always hope.